The realization struck different Japanese commanders at different moments. Some grasped the terrible truth early. Others clung to delusions until the very end. But eventually, each confronted the same devastating reality. America possessed industrial might beyond Japanese comprehension. A staff meeting room in Tokyo, December morning, 1941. Officers moved through corridors with barely contained excitement. Victory celebrations echoed from nearby rooms. Charts covered tables showing successful strikes across the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto stood apart from the festivities. His expression remained carefully neutral. No smile crossed his lips. No satisfaction showed in his eyes. While others saw triumph, he saw catastrophe approaching. The previous 6 hours had unfolded exactly as planned. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. 8 battleships sat on the harbor bottom. Nearly 200 American aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. Japanese losses were minimal. Yet Yamamoto felt only growing dread. He understood what his celebrating colleagues did not. Japan had just committed national suicide. Through his office window, he watched junior officers embracing. Their joy was infectious. Their confidence was absolute. Their understanding of American power was non-existent. Yamamoto had walked through Detroit automobile plants. He had witnessed assembly lines producing cars faster than Japanese factories could build bicycles. He had seen Texas oil fields stretching beyond the horizon. Each derrick pumped more petroleum than entire Japanese wells produced in months. He had lived among Americans. He had studied at Harvard University. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He knew what Japan had awakened. The mathematics of defeat were already written. Production statistics told the story more clearly than any battle report ever could. American industrial capacity dwarfed Japanese manufacturing by ratios that made victory impossible. His fellow commanders dismissed such concerns. They spoke of Japanese fighting spirit. They praised superior training. They believed willpower could overcome material disadvantage. They were about to learn otherwise. 6 months earlier, Yamamoto had warned Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye with prophetic words that now seemed carved in stone. Those words haunted him as celebration continued around him. The warning had been precise, direct, unmistakable. Japan could fight hard for 6 months. Beyond that, defeat was certain. Industrial capacity would determine everything. America possessed 10 times Japan's manufacturing power. The numbers were not debatable. Pearl Harbor's tactical success masked strategic failure. American aircraft carriers had escaped the attack. More critically, Japan had unified a divided American public behind total war. Previously reluctant Americans now demanded vengeance. The productive giant was stirring. When it fully awakened, Japanese resistance would crumble like paper before flame. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese expansion had followed predictable patterns. Manchuria fell in 1931. Full-scale war with China began in 1937. French Indochina was occupied in 1940. Each victory fed appetites for more territory. Japanese planners understood their industrial disadvantage. Intelligence reports provided accurate statistics. In 1937, Japan controlled approximately 5.2% of global manufacturing capacity. This matched France roughly. It equaled half of Britain's industrial output. It represented 1/8 of Soviet production. America commanded 42% of world industrial capacity. Even during Depression years, American war-making potential exceeded Japanese capacity by factors of 7 to 10. These numbers were available. They were discussed. They were ignored. The gamble rested on specific assumptions about American character. Japanese leaders believed Americans were soft, decadent, divided, unwilling to endure hardship for distant objectives. Pearl Harbor would shock them into accepting Japanese hegemony in Asia. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. Pearl Harbor accomplished the opposite of Japanese intentions. Instead of intimidating America into negotiation, the attack unified American society behind total war. Roosevelt addressed Congress the day after Pearl Harbor. His speech electrified the nation. Previously, isolationist Americans now demanded complete victory. The industrial mobilization that followed would dwarf Japanese productive capacity. The plan itself had seemed elegant. Lightning strikes would establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Resource-rich territories would supply Japanese war needs. America would face the choice between costly reconquest or negotiated settlement. Japanese strategists assumed Americans would choose negotiation. The assumption was based on fundamental misunderstanding of American psychology and industrial reality. Victory required American unwillingness to pay the price of total war. Yet America possessed resources that made such prices affordable. Japanese planners projected their own limitations onto an enemy operating under completely different economic realities. The first 6 months seemed to validate Japanese strategy. Victories came with breathtaking speed. Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Dutch East Indies, Burma. All fell to Japanese arms within months. By March 1942, Japanese forces controlled territory from the Chinese interior to the Central Pacific. The defensive perimeter was established. Raw materials flowed toward Japan. The war appeared to be proceeding according to plan. These early successes created dangerous overconfidence among Japanese commanders. The ease of conquest suggested that American industrial power had been exaggerated. Imperial General Headquarters began planning even more ambitious operations. Warning signs appeared for those willing to see them. The Doolittle Raid on April 18, 1942, demonstrated American capabilities that should have concerned Tokyo. 16 B-25 bombers launched from USS Hornet struck Japanese cities. Damage was minimal. Psychological impact was profound. Sacred Japanese territory had been violated. The homeland had been bombed. The raid exposed Japanese vulnerability and prompted decisions that would prove fatal. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 provided another warning. Though tactically inconclusive, the strategic outcome favored America. Japan's planned invasion of Port Moresby was abandoned. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese expansion had been checked. American forces, even when outnumbered, could fight the Imperial Japanese Navy to a standstill. This should have alarmed Japanese planners. Instead, they dismissed it as a temporary setback. Then came Midway, the battle that would shatter Japanese naval supremacy and expose fatal flaws in their strategic calculations. Admiral Yamamoto designed the Midway operation to lure remaining American carriers into decisive battle. Japanese intelligence estimated American carrier strength in the Pacific at 2 vessels. They believed USS Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, was out of action. Reality differed dramatically. American shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor had performed miraculous repairs. Yorktown returned to service after just 72 hours of round-the-clock work. 3 American carriers would face 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. More critically, American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken enough of the Japanese JN-25 code to determine that AF, the target of Japan's planned operation, was Midway Atoll. To confirm this intelligence, Americans had Midway send a false message in plain text reporting freshwater shortages. Japanese radio traffic soon mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The trap was set. June 4, 1942. Dawn broke clear over the Pacific. Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched strikes against Midway Island. While their aircraft were away, American torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese fleet. The torpedo attacks were slaughtered. 41 of 41 Devastator torpedo bombers were shot down. But they drew Japanese fighters to low altitude. Combat air patrol was scattered. The sky cleared for American dive bombers. At approximately 10:22 a.m., Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived simultaneously above the Japanese carriers. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned with fires that could not be controlled. Their decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft when bombs struck. The explosions were catastrophic. Hiryu, the fourth carrier, survived temporarily and launched strikes that crippled Yorktown. But by evening, Hiryu too was fatally damaged by American dive bombers. By June 7th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had sunk. 1 cruiser was also lost. Japan suffered 3,057 casualties, lost 248 aircraft, and critically, approximately 100 trained pilots. American losses were lighter: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, 307 men. The immediate tactical impact was clear. Japan had lost strategic initiative in the Pacific. The deeper significance took longer to manifest. Midway exposed fundamental weaknesses in Japanese planning, training, and industrial capacity that would prove terminal. Japan entered the war with 6 large fleet carriers and 5 smaller ones. America had 3 large carriers in the Pacific when war began. The critical question became replacement capacity. How quickly could each nation replace losses? The answer would devastate Japanese strategic planning. American industrial mobilization represented the greatest sustained economic effort in human history. President Roosevelt, speaking to Congress less than a month after Pearl Harbor, announced production goals that seemed fantastic. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943, 120,000 tanks in the same period, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns. These targets were met, then exceeded. Statistics told the story of American productive power. In 3 years following Midway, Japanese shipyards constructed 6 aircraft carriers. American shipyards delivered 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and dozens of escort carriers. Essex-class carriers represented an industrial achievement Japanese planners could barely comprehend. The Navy initially ordered 32 Essex-class carriers. 24 were built. 14 saw combat service in World War II. Each displaced 30,000 tons. Each measured 870 feet in length. Each carried more than 90 aircraft. At peak production, American shipyards launched 1 Essex-class carrier approximately every 6 weeks. In 1944 alone, American factories produced more aircraft than Japan built during the entire war. America produced approximately 297,000 aircraft during the war. Japan produced approximately 76,000 tons. American shipyards delivered more tonnage in the first 4 months of 1943 than Japan launched in 7 years. Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit produced 1 B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. Numbers extended across every category of military production. American factories built 86,000 tanks. Japan managed approximately 2,000 medium and heavy tanks. America produced 2 million trucks. Japan built approximately 165,000. Artillery pieces, small arms, ammunition, every category of war material. American production exceeded Japanese output by factors of 5 to 20. Japanese military planners received much of this information through intelligence reports. The numbers created cognitive dissonance that prevented proper strategic adjustment. Figures were so overwhelming that accepting them meant accepting inevitable defeat. Japanese commanders chose hope instead of reality. They hoped American quality would prove inferior. They hoped Japanese fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantage. They hoped tactical brilliance could substitute for industrial capacity. Hope was not strategy. Admiral Yamamoto never suffered these delusions. His understanding of American power deepened as the war progressed. Whether he actually spoke the famous words attributed to him after Pearl Harbor remains debated among historians. No written record exists of the exact quotation about awakening a sleeping giant. The line appeared first in the 1970 film Tora, 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 but the sentiment accurately reflected his documented views. What Yamamoto definitely wrote in a letter on January 9, 1942, was more telling. Military men could scarcely pride themselves on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It was more a matter of shame for the one smitten. He understood that defeating an unprepared enemy proved nothing about relative strength. The true test would come when America fully mobilized its industrial might. That mobilization gathered momentum throughout 1942. It reached full force by 1943. Industrial statistics translated into operational reality across every Pacific battlefield. At Guadalcanal, from August 1942 through February 1943, American forces demonstrated their ability to sustain combat operations across vast oceanic distances. The campaign became grinding attritional struggle. It exposed Japanese vulnerability in logistics, supply, replacement, industrial capacity. Japan had planned for quick, decisive battles. Sustained operations draining resources had not been anticipated. Japanese merchant fleet, essential for supplying far-flung garrisons, steadily eroded under American submarine attack. Japanese merchant ship production never matched losses. In 1943, American submarines sank more Japanese tonnage than Japanese shipyards launched. By 1944, Japan's merchant marine was in terminal decline. Supply of captured territories became impossible. Transportation of resources back to home islands failed. Oil from Dutch East Indies, the resource Japan had gone to war to secure, remained undelivered. Japanese aircraft production illustrated similar patterns. While American factories turned out newer, better designs in massive quantities, Japanese production stagnated in numbers and technology. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter, brilliant when introduced in 1940, remained in frontline service throughout the war. Only minor modifications were made. American fighters progressed from adequate F-4F Wildcat to superior F-6F Hellcat to exceptional F-4U Corsair. Each iteration outperformed its predecessor. By 1943, American fighters were demonstrably superior to Japanese designs. They appeared in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese air units. Pilot training differentials compounded these advantages. America's vast educational infrastructure supported massive pilot training programs. Aviation cadets received thorough instruction in multi-engine aircraft, navigation, tactics, gunnery. Completion rates remained high. The pipeline of new pilots grew throughout the war. Japan's training programs, resource-constrained and casualty-depleted, shortened training periods and reduced standards. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with a fraction of flight hours their American counterparts received. Superior American aircraft flown by better-trained pilots produced predictable results. Japanese aircrew losses became unsustainable. Even as evidence of American industrial supremacy mounted, many Japanese commanders clung to hope grounded in Japan's warrior ethos. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan, suggested that superior morale could overcome material disadvantages. Bushido traditions emphasized honor, sacrifice, death before surrender. These cultural factors, while producing individual acts of remarkable courage, prevented realistic strategic reassessment. The assault on the Mariana Islands in summer 1944 marked the moment when Japanese high command could no longer maintain illusions about the war's trajectory. American invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944. American forces, supported by massive naval gunfire and abundant supplies, steadily overwhelmed Japanese defenders. Fighting was savage. Japanese soldiers and civilians chose death over capture. But the outcome was never in doubt. Saipan fell on July 9, 1944. Tinian followed on August 1. Guam was secured by August 10. Strategic implications were severe. The Marianas placed American B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of Japanese home islands. The carefully constructed defensive perimeter had been penetrated. Japan itself now faced direct strategic bombing. The loss signaled that Japan could no longer prevent American advances. Overwhelming superiority in ships, aircraft, supplies, and trained personnel meant American forces could strike anywhere and prevail through sheer material advantage. Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo, who had pushed Japan into war, received blame for the Marianas disaster. He was forced to resign on July 18, 1944, having lost all political support. His successor, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited an impossible situation. The war was effectively lost, but surrender remained politically and militarily unthinkable. Japan would fight on, hoping for miracles that would never come. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19-20, 1944, concurrent with the Marianas invasion, provided another demonstration of American material supremacy. Japanese naval aviation, attempting to attack American carriers, was slaughtered. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days of air combat, Japan lost approximately 480 aircraft and 3 carriers, including the newest carrier Taiho. American losses were comparatively light. Japanese naval aviation, already weakened by years of attrition, never recovered from this beating. American commanders now understood they held overwhelming advantages. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet, and General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Southwest Pacific Forces, conducted operations with confidence born of material abundance. When planning invasions, American forces assumed generous supply ratios, abundant ammunition, continuous reinforcement. Japanese defenders, by contrast, fought with dwindling supplies, scarce ammunition, no prospect of relief. The Philippines campaign, October 1944 through July 1945, exemplified this disparity. American forces landed on Leyte on October 20, 1944, supported by the largest naval armada assembled in the Pacific War. Japanese naval forces, in desperate gambit, committed virtually their entire remaining fleet to defend the Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 23–26, 1944, resulted. It became the largest naval battle in history. It ended in complete Japanese defeat. 4 separate engagements made up the battle. In the Sibuyan Sea, American carrier aircraft sank the massive battleship Musashi. In Surigao Strait, American battleships and destroyers destroyed a Japanese southern force. Off Samar, Japanese center force encountered American escort carriers in confused action. Japanese command failures prevented complete American disaster. Finally, off Cape Engano, American carriers destroyed remnants of Japanese carrier aviation. By October 26th, Japanese naval power had effectively ceased to exist as organized force. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, thousands of trained seamen. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again sortie at fleet strength. Strategic bombing of Japan, which intensified throughout 1944 and 1945, brought the war's industrial implications home to Japanese civilians and leaders alike. B-29 superfortresses, flying from the Marianas, struck Japanese cities with increasing frequency and severity. The bombing campaign evolved from precision strikes against specific industrial targets to area bombing designed to destroy Japan's urban manufacturing centers. Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9–10, 1945, represented the destructive peak of the campaign. 334 B-29 bombers dropped approximately 1,065 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo's densely packed residential and industrial districts. The resulting firestorm killed approximately 100,000 people. 16 square miles of the city were destroyed. More than 1 million people were left homeless. It was the single most destructive air raid in human history, more deadly than either atomic bombing that would follow. Toll on Japanese cities was staggering. 66 other cities suffered similar incendiary attacks. By war's end, approximately 350,000 to 500,000 Japanese civilians had died in the strategic bombing campaign. Major industrial cities were reduced to ash. Yet even this destruction did not break Japanese will to resist. The military government, dominated by army officers committed to fighting to national extinction, refused to consider surrender. Emperor Hirohito, traditionally remaining above political and military decisions, became increasingly concerned as the true situation became clear. The emperor received regular briefings on the war's progress. By early 1945, he understood Japan faced defeat. Yet the emperor's constitutional position and the political strength of the army prevented him from directly ordering surrender. Japan's government was paralyzed between reality of certain defeat and cultural impossibility of accepting it. Soviet Union's entry into war against Japan on August 8, 1945, shattered Japan's last diplomatic hope. Japanese leaders had attempted to use Soviet neutrality to negotiate settlement. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941 had allowed both nations to focus elsewhere. Japanese diplomats hoped Stalin might mediate between Japan and Western allies, perhaps securing terms short of unconditional surrender. This hope was delusional. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had promised to enter war against Japan within 90 days of Germany's defeat. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. On August 8, exactly 90 days later, Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria with overwhelming strength. They crushed Japanese armies that had been stripped of resources to defend home islands. In 1 week, Soviet forces overran Japanese positions that had taken years to construct. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's most formidable formation, disintegrated under Soviet assault. Soviet invasion meant Japan now faced enemies on all fronts, with no prospect of diplomatic escape. Yet even this catastrophe did not immediately produce surrender. Japanese government, particularly army leadership, proposed continuing war through national suicide, inflicting such casualties on American invasion forces that favorable peace terms might still be secured. This fantasy persisted even after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9. The bombs killed approximately 130,000 people initially. Tens of thousands died later from radiation effects. Yet within Japan's military government, army hardliners argued that surrender remained dishonorable. Only Emperor Hirohito's personal intervention, breaking with constitutional precedent, forced Japan's capitulation. On August 15, 1945, The emperor's recorded voice broadcast surrender to the Japanese people. It was the first time most Japanese had heard their emperor speak. His words carefully avoided the term surrender, instead announcing that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The announcement stunned a population that had been told Japan was winning. Reality of defeat, suddenly acknowledged, shattered propaganda that had sustained Japanese morale. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, oversaw Japan's occupation and reconstruction. The occupation exposed Japanese people directly to American material abundance and organizational efficiency. American soldiers arrived with equipment, supplies, and resources that Japanese civilians had never imagined existed. For Japanese military leaders, post-war interrogation and war crimes trials forced painful acknowledgement of their failures. Former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, on trial for war crimes, was forced to admit that Japan had underestimated American industrial capacity. "We did not adequately understand American potential," he testified. This represented extraordinary admission from a man who had led Japan into war. Post-war interrogations of Japanese military personnel revealed systematic failures in understanding American military capabilities beyond simple production statistics. Japanese planners had failed to grasp American logistics capabilities, the ability to project power across vast oceanic distances while maintaining adequate supply. They had underestimated American technological innovation. Most critically, they had failed to understand that American military doctrine emphasized material advantage rather than warrior spirit. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagamo, who had commanded the carrier striking force at Pearl Harbor and Midway, died by suicide during the Battle of Saipan in July 1944. But his staff officers survived to testify about Japanese planning assumptions. They acknowledged that Japanese intelligence had provided accurate information about American industrial production. The failure was not intelligence gathering, but strategic assessment. Japanese commanders had known the numbers, but refused to accept their implications. Post-war analysis by both Japanese and American historians identified the core of Japan's strategic failure. Japan had gambled on short war because Japanese leaders understood they could not win a long one. But the gamble rested on assumptions about American psychology that proved completely wrong. Japanese planners believed Americans were soft, decadent, divided, and unwilling to endure hardship. Pearl Harbor would shock them into accepting Japanese hegemony in Asia. Instead, Pearl Harbor unified American society behind total war. The attack transformed American industrial might from potential to kinetic. Roosevelt's production goals, which had seemed fantastic in December 1941, were met and exceeded because American industry, labor, and agriculture fully mobilized. Women entered factories in massive numbers. Agricultural productivity increased through mechanization. Raw material extraction expanded dramatically. The American economy grew at 15% annually throughout the war years, simultaneously supporting military production, civilian consumption, and massive aid to allied nations. Contrast with Japan was stark. Japan's economy, far smaller to begin with, faced crippling constraints. American submarine warfare devastated Japan's merchant fleet. This cut off resources from conquered territories. Strategic bombing destroyed urban manufacturing. Blockade reduced Japanese industrial output through raw material shortages. By 1945, Japanese aircraft production had declined to approximately 150 aircraft per month. American production exceeded 8,000 monthly. Japanese soldiers faced ammunition shortages. American forces had ammunition to waste. Japanese civilians starved. American servicemen ate abundantly. Several former Japanese officers, in memoirs and interviews decades after the war, offered frank assessments of their strategic failures. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, last commander of the combined fleet, wrote in his 1950 memoirs that Japan had fought a war it could not win from the beginning. We understood American material superiority intellectually, but we did not grasp its implications emotionally. We believed spirit could overcome matter. This was our fundamental error. Mitsumasa Yonai, who served as Prime Minister and Navy Minister at various times during the war, told interrogators in 1945 that Japanese naval officers had warned civilian leaders that war with America was unwinnable. These warnings were ignored by Army leaders who controlled government policy. Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving fighter ace with 64 confirmed victories, wrote extensively after the war about declining quality of Japanese pilots and aircraft as the conflict progressed. In his autobiography, Samurai, published in 1957, Sakai described watching newly trained pilots deployed to combat with minimal flight hours. They were slaughtered. They never had a chance. By 1944, we veteran pilots knew we were losing. We could see the quality of American aircraft improving, while ours stagnated. We could see numbers of American planes increasing, while ours declined. But we kept fighting because we had no choice. Industrial statistics that documented Japan's defeat were compiled after the war by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. The final accounting was stark. America produced approximately 2/3 of all Allied military equipment during the war. American factories had built more than 5,000 ships. American shipyards replaced all Allied shipping sunk by Axis forces, and then built additional capacity beyond pre-war tonnage. Japanese production, by comparison, had proven utterly inadequate. Japan built 6 carriers after Midway. America built 122 carriers of all types. Japan produced 76,000 aircraft total. America produced nearly 300,000. Japan built approximately 165,000 trucks. America built 2 million in steel production, oil refining, aluminum fabrication, electronics, and every other category of industrial output. American production exceeded Japanese capacity by factors of 10 to 20. Human cost of Japan's miscalculation was staggering. Approximately 2,800,000 Japanese military personnel died in the war. Between 500,000 and 1 million Japanese civilians died from bombing, starvation, and war-related causes. These casualties occurred in a war that Japanese leaders had initiated while understanding it was unwinnable. For the Japanese High Command, the moment of true realization came at different times for different individuals. Some, like Yamamoto, understood from the beginning. Others maintained delusions until Saipan fell, or Leyte Gulf, or the atomic bombings. But eventually, all confronted the same inescapable truth. In decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually became the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s, the lessons of 1941, 1945 shaped Japanese thinking about power, prosperity, and international relations. Modern Japan achieved far greater success through trade and industry than it ever gained through military conquest. Industrial capacity that Japanese leaders in the 1930s sought to seize through force was ultimately developed through peaceful enterprise. The story of Japan's High Command finally realizing America's true power is ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangers of strategic self-deception. Information was available, warnings were given, evidence accumulated. Yet institutional momentum, cultural biases, and political constraints prevented rational strategic reassessment until defeat became undeniable. For individual Japanese officers, realization came through different experiences at different times. Some witnessed it in the avalanche of American aircraft appearing over every battlefield. Others saw it in endless supplies, supporting American advances. Some understood when their own forces went hungry, while American prisoners ate abundantly. Others comprehended only when B-29s turned their cities to ash. But all eventually learned the same lesson. America's industrial capacity was not propaganda. It was not exaggeration. It was material reality that determined the war's outcome as surely as if final battles had already been fought in December 1941. The productive capacity existed. The organizational ability existed. The raw materials existed. The transportation infrastructure existed. The trained workforce existed. Everything needed for total war mobilization was already in place. Pearl Harbor simply activated what was already there. Japanese High Command had awakened a sleeping giant. That giant possessed productive power beyond Japanese capacity to resist. The mathematical certainty of defeat had been written in production statistics before Pearl Harbor. Japanese planners had access to those numbers. Intelligence reports provided accurate data. Economic analyses were available. Industrial surveys had been conducted. They simply chose not to believe the evidence until it became undeniable. In that choice lay the destruction of Imperial Japan and the deaths of millions. The price of strategic delusion was paid in full by August 1945. It served as history's most expensive lesson in the relationship between industrial power and military outcome. Factory capacity determines battlefield results more surely than fighting spirit. Production statistics predict victory more accurately than tactical brilliance. Material advantage overwhelms moral superiority when the disparity becomes too great to bridge. These lessons were written in the rubble of Japanese cities, paid for with Japanese blood, and learned through Japanese suffering. The awakened giant had demonstrated its power. The demonstration was complete, devastating, and unforgettable. Never again would industrial capacity be so thoroughly underestimated. Never again would production statistics be so completely ignored. The price of such miscalculation had been made clear to the entire world. Japan's high command had learned America's true power. The education was thorough, painful, and permanent. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its strength had proven exactly as devastating as Admiral Yamamoto had feared it would be.